Okay, dear colleagues and friends, on behalf of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, that's FES, Institute for Global Dialogue, IGD, and the Mapungubwe Institute, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Yacoob Omar, and I'm the Director of Operations of MISTRA. I will facilitate the first segment of this program, while my good friend from IGD, Dr. Philani Mthembu, will host the rest of the program. The speakers and respondents will be introduced when they begin speaking. There's no doubt that the 2021 German elections were watched closely by all because Germany matters in so many different ways and not just for the football. Germany matters because it is at the heart of the European integration project, both politically and economically. Germany matters to South Africa, as shown by the two countries holding the 10th Binational Commission in March 2020. South Africa is Germany's top trading partner in Africa. And as the invite indicated, the leader of the SDP as Minister of Finance, Olaf Scholz, while he was Minister of Finance, successfully joined South Africa's former Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, and 3 other G20 counterparts in calling for a global minimum corporate tax. But before I start sounding like the ambassador I used to be, talking about the importance of our bilateral relations, etc., let us focus on the theme of this webinar: Resurgence of Social Democracy in Germany, expectations from a possible new coalition government. Please observe, colleagues, the normal basic ground rules we're all familiar with. Mute or you'll be muted. Please make use of the Q&A function to make any comments, raise questions, etc. When Philani takes over, he will allow you to speak as and when you raise your hands, and also be picking up some of the questions you raise. The German elections matter for all of us struggling to achieve a progressive world order. In that sense, a future social democracy matters. Be you part of the ANC, which is a natural ally of the SPD, or an environmentalist, or those of us wanting business to play a positive role in society. So to kick us off on that theme, I will call upon one of the co-directors of the South Africa office of the FES, Dirksen, to explain to us in Africa and South Africa the actual results and why do we speak of resurgence of social democracy. Over to you, Uta.
Thank you very much, Abba, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our webinar today as well. So why do we speak of a resurgence of social democracy? And Sebastian, if you could just help me perhaps with the presentation. I'd like to share some polls and statistics with you on the results as well. If you could just go back 2 steps maybe. Yes, so let's start off with this, which is the poll results in the year leading up to the election. And if you look at that bright red line that's sort of in the middle of that graph, that is the Social Democrats, that's the SPD. So you can see for the longest time coming up to this national election, we were pottering around the 15% mark, going under, going over. And then you have right at the end of that graph, in the last quarter, really, before the election, taking off in a spectacular fashion in the polls. And Sebastian, if you go to the next slide, you can see that these polls translated into results in the election as well. So you have in that column on the left, you have the election results, and you can see that the SPD won the largest percentage of votes with a 25.7%. But why do we also speak of a resurgence? One is the comparison with the last elections. If you look at the diagram at the bottom, which is the comparative change to the elections in 2017, you can see that the Social Democrats won a good 5% compared to the last election. So clearly there's an upward trend. But also on the same day that the SPD won the national elections, it won the elections in 2 federal states. And some of you might know that Germany has a very strong federal system as well. And the Social Democrats are now the governing party in 7 of the 16 federal states of Germany, and partners in a coalition where they're not the strongest party in a further 4. Another indicator of this resurgence for me is the direct seats that the SPD could win, which were in this election 121 seats compared to 58 seats in 2017. So there was a really strong performance in the direct electoral districts as well. But what does this resurgence mean for the next government of Germany? I mean, that's the big question that's being debated, negotiated, explored at the moment within Germany. If you go back to the diagram at the bottom, you can see that even though in terms of the results, the Conservatives, which is the CDU-CSU, which is represented in black in all of these diagrams, was fairly close in terms of the overall result, with just 1.6 percentage points less, it lost almost 9% compared to the previous election. So making this result for the Conservatives a big defeat and effectively weakening their position. Now, in terms of the government, I mean, clearly 25.7% is not a majority. So if you look at these diagrams, at that semicircle you have on the top right there, those are the seats in the German parliament, in the Bundestag. There's a total of 735 seats. And you can see here by party how many seats each party has won. The red are the Social Democrats, the SPD, the black, the Conservative, the Green Party, yellow is the Liberals, blue is the far right, and the sort of violet is the left party. You need at least 368 seats for a parliamentary majority. So now theoretically we have various coalitions, how you could join these colorful blocks to gain that majority, but currently and politically, the most likely in the current climate in Germany appears the coalition of Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals. So the red, the green, and the yellow, which is why in Germany we like to call it a traffic light coalition, because it has the three colors of the traffic light, or as you say here in South Africa, a robot. And these are also the parties that right this moment in Germany this week are holding exploratory talks, which are the first stage to the forming of a coalition government. So the next step would then be the actual coalition negotiations to then hopefully form a government under a Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
Thank you, Uta. That was really useful, and especially for South African audiences that don't understand the complexities of German politics. Over to you, Sebastian, who is also the co-director of the FES office in South Africa. Maybe if you could give us a sense of what are the factors that were responsible for this resurgence.
Thank you so much, Abba. Thank you so much, Philani, IGD, MISTRA for this event and for being able to discuss that resurgence. Now, it would be very easy to say, well, part of the explanation is that, well, the weakness of others, and certainly that is a factor in this results. Also, I haven't experienced this, the SPD, my party, as being as united as in this campaign in a very long time. And also it arguably ran the best campaign, like the most professional campaign. I think hardly anybody in Germany would argue that, would disagree with that. But what really does account for the electoral success, and I would like to show you where did the new SPD voters actually come from. And what you see in this diagram is well, like the new voters of SPD that previously didn't vote for SPD based on exit polls. And what you can see is that the largest share came from the CDU, the Conservative Party, Merkel's party, 1.5 million. But then, so center-right, but then the next biggest block of voters actually came from the left, like left party. So really from all sides. And thirdly, and I think this is very interesting from a South African perspective, because this is the challenge that I believe South African parties also face, SPD was able to mobilize a lot of non-voters, voters that previously did not participate in the previous election. So I want to highlight three different factors that account for that. The first one, without a doubt, even though it's not a direct election in Germany, unlike in South Africa, we vote for parties and then Parliament has to elect the Chancellor, the head of government, the candidate played a huge role. or the candidates of the three major parties played a huge role. And it was the first post-Merkel election after 16 years of her rule, and the incumbent wasn't running. And that is quite unique in post-war German history. The SPD, the Social Democrats, decided very early on to send their most experienced politician, more than a year ago, first ones to nominate a candidate for Chancellor, former Minister of Labor, Mayor of Hamburg, currently Finance Minister and Vice Chancellor. So clearly the most senior, the most experienced person. You would probably not describe him usually as overly charismatic, even though he has a sense of humor, more matter-of-factly, centrist, serious, no-nonsense politicians, in that sense, very like Merkel, and very capable of getting things done. Well, I know this phrase, slogan is taken in South Africa, but the SPD focused very much her campaign on that, on her main candidate, and tailored it to Olaf Scholz. And he outperformed the Conservative and Green candidate in the eyes of the public. He was rated most competent on almost all of the issues by a huge margin. He won all of the three TV debates with big margins, according to the polls. And in this graph here, you can see how his rating went up leading up to the election in September, widening the gap as the campaign went on to the Conservative and the Green candidate for Chancellor. So that's the first factor. The second factor, and that is very interesting, if you ask voters, or what do they base their decision on, yes, the candidate is important. You see it here on the left for voters of SPD, Conservatives and Greens. More important than party loyalty, but even more important are issues according to the self-description of voters. And I believe the SPD had a very timely program that resonated with the issues that voters, according to the polls, rated as most important in this election. Firstly, pensions and the future of the welfare state. That was noted to be the most important issue, followed by climate and environmental policy, and thirdly, jobs and economy. Now, if you look at the competence attributed to parties by voters, clearly the Greens are seen more competent on climate policy. Yet the SPD is seen far more competent on the first issue, and also on average seen more competent on all three issues combined. And I believe this to be an important factor. In recent years, the Social Democrats clearly have gone back to the left again, to some extent programmatically, back to social democratic roots of social justice and redistribution, without going back on cultural issues and a more liberal contemporary understanding of a diverse society, like neither seeking moral high ground on cultural identity issues, nor playing to nationalist or even xenophobic resentments like other left parties in Europe have chosen to do. And this was summed up in the campaign motto, respect, that was very much at the center of the SPD campaign. And in material terms, respect meant, for example, as you can see in this poster here, the demand for €12 minimum wage, like an increase, substantial increase in the minimum wage per hour, guaranteed pension levels, affordable housing, etc. And as a result of that campaign, if you look at the different constituency of the electorate, while they are ever more diverse and clearly very contested, all of them, in their voting patterns, SPD managed to be strongest party again with pensioners, with white-collar workers, and with blue-collar workers. So really regaining its traditional base. And the third factor, now looking beyond also this short phase of a hot campaign, I believe this to be a result of a larger renewal process that has been ongoing for a long time, that is painful, long and complicated, and not completed, certainly. And this renewal, not only in the programmatic sense, as I had lined out, but also in terms of participation and representation on a local level. The party opened up also to activists on local level, and it shows when you look at the face of the new parliamentary group, that is not only a third bigger now compared to the last one, but also very interesting in its composition. More than half of members of parliament for the SPD are in parliament for the first time. A third of the SPD parliamentary group is below 40 years of age. The share of members of parliament for the SPD with a migrant background is now a lot closer to the about 20% of actual modern German society. And also SPD doubles the representation of the formerly marginalized Eastern Germany. So the parliamentary group that Nina went back to after the elections looks very different to the previous one. And I believe this to be not only a result of the election, but also part of the explanation of SPD's success this time.
Thanks, Sebastian. And as I always say, slogans may sound similar, it's the content that makes a difference. Yeah. But thanks for explaining to us in a way that relates to our own situation. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the third respondent in this segment. That's Dr. Nina Scheer, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, was a member of the German Bundestag, the parliament since 2013, as part of the Social Democratic Party, vice chair of the Parliamentary Advisory Board on Sustainable Development, and is a member of the SPD Committee on Basic Values. So Nina, I think, what was different in this campaign compared to previous ones? What would you account for the success of your party? Tell us from Berlin, how cold is it and how is the political climate there?
Thank you very much. A few of the points which are the most the significant things are told by Uta and also Sebastian. But I want to go a little bit deeper with some other points. I think it's not the best thing for the Social Democratic Party, but we have to know that really the weakness of the others was also a big point. I think it's not healthy not to point this, because we have to handle also this good result for the SPD and to continue and to handle this also this signal we have with this policy signal from this, and focus. This means for me also, you realized with the last slide also the differences to the other results from the other elections, and one thing is also that the women, the part of the women is the same. And it was a hard discussion also with the head of the Green Party, with Annalena Baerbock, that I had, it was my meaning that, I thought that it was not every time really justice handling the women. And we have really be careful in the policy feeling and policy development that the rule of the women is not going back. This is one really big effort we have now. It was not mostly, it was not a thing of the Social Democratic Party, but in all the country, I thought with the policy discussion, we have an effort to have a look on this. And the good thing or the progress in this election was really that we could focus with this respect. We put on the top of all that a lot of people thought, oh, okay, it's worth to go to the election. And I think this was really a big success of this time, because in the other election we had a lot of discussion about how we can go to the people, how we can get them to go to the election, to vote. And this was really a big problem. And also the discussion which rule will have the parties at all, the parties inside the democracy. And I think this is also a big point we have to follow as the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and also the parties to focus the special rule of the parties inside the democracy. Also because when you have a look all over the world, I think there's, when I'm right, there is no democracy worldwide without parties. And when the parties are getting broken or have no rule anymore because everybody is going only on Facebook and only social media and only give their interest somewhere in the internet to some clicks, they can get they can tell their political mind, then the parties will have no rule anymore. And this is, I think, really a big threat for the democracies worldwide. So this was a big point, that the parties could get the people to the election. And in my election district, we had 80% went to the election. And I think this is really a big result. And I won also directly. And so this is exactly the result we could see on the slide, that when the SPD was the winner, this was also because people went back to the election and got the trust back that the election has a worth in our democracy. So this was a good point. Another result I think we have to get on this election, this is also worldwide, I think, a problem, or something we have to have a look on. It is getting lost to make a good difference between meaning and facts. And when this is going in trouble to make a difference between meanings on the one side and facts on the other side, then you will get a big problem with the climate protection and also a lot of other efforts in the political context to handle and to be next to the science also. You can't be next to the science when you have not a clear difference between meanings on the one side and facts, handling the facts on the other side. This is also something I got from not only from this point of the election, but from this discussion culture we have to handle at the moment. And the progresses in the environmental things and climate protection and energy transition, you will only get when you have really clear the facts on climate change.
Great, thank you very much for that. We're still going to come back to you, Dr. Nina. I'm going to now hand over to my friend Philani, who will be facilitating the rest of the discussion. Over to you, Philani.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much, Abba. I think this has been really quite fascinating. And I think also for a South African audience, it's actually quite interesting to look at some of these dynamics that are unfolding. I think also just noting also that Joachim Schuster can only join us until 1 o'clock. I think it will be great to sort of have just a conversation with him, especially being a member of the European Parliament since 2014, And also, of course, for a South African audience, being vice chair of the EU delegation for relations with South Africa. So I think it will be great sort of having dissected aspects of the election and the result, just to sort of go back and think, what does this mean really for Germany in the world? And I think maybe first, Joachim, if I could, is just to ask why, you know, were international affairs not really an issue during the elections? So maybe if we could just sort of start there and unpack that. It seemed a lot of issues, of course, important issues, that yes, had a domestic impact, but many of those issues also have an international impact. But it seemed, looking from the outside, that international affairs didn't feature quite strongly in the elections.
Yes, thank you, Philani. I think there are several reasons for this. On the one hand, it's a special situation in Germany. The voters' view on foreign policy is largely positive. There's a broad consensus among the population on foreign policy issues. And of course, the focus is not on the details and on the concrete implementation of every foreign policy initiative. Rather, it is about what it's perceived as a general direction of German foreign policies. This includes, for example, the membership in the European Union, the unconditional and not further specified support of multilateralism, the continuation of German role in international institutions, the self-perception as a civil power, the focus on the implementation of sustainable development goals, and the like. Voters see this basically cooperative tenor as positive, and even between the parties, this basic lines of foreign policy are little disputed. And therefore, normally we have no disputes in elections campaign on foreign affairs issues. But secondly, I think one can surmise is that during the election campaign, the majority of the voters are primarily interested in issues that affect their own reality of life. This means the so-called bread and butter issues play the biggest role in the election campaign. And these are primarily heating costs, mobility, taxes, family support, etc., and so on. But because it's also written as a question in the chat, for a long time, the election campaign was with no content. The main point of the first months was orientated towards internal party power struggles between Laschet, especially between Armin Laschet and Markus Söder, and personal mistakes of the candidates, especially Armin Laschet, but as well from the Christian Democratic Union, as well as Annalena Baerbock from the Greens. And in this phase, and this was in July, August, I think it was the main point, the content was rather thin on the ground, and at the end we have more content in our election campaign and in the public disputes, but also in this time the personal questions. I think it was prioritized in this campaign, and therefore we have no dispute on foreign affairs issues. I think it's a problem.
This is quite an interesting point, actually. And it sort of leads me nicely to this next question. Given that there wasn't sort of glaringly obvious major foreign policy differences, the question is then, with a potential coalition, so this Ampel coalition, what would actually be different in a sense? Are we likely to see a continuation from what we have had in terms of Germany's role in a changing international landscape? I think, you know, it would be really quite interesting, especially for a South African audience and a broader African audience, to really think about what impact will a potential coalition have on how Germany sees itself in a changing international landscape.
I can't say at the end what will be the result of the talks between the party leaders concerning the coalition. But I estimate that we will have a continuation. That is the main, will be the main result. We have disputes about our role within the European Union because the fiscal, we have disputes on the fiscal rules, for example, how we deal with debt and so on. But it's other questions I think will not be in the focus, and I think that's a problem because the debate in Germany as well as in Europe on the huge geopolitical changes are only at the beginning. Now we are talking a lot about that we have to increase European sovereignty, or some say also we should be autonomous. The European autonomy, we need autonomy. That's only catchwords, and there is no clear content, and that is a problem. And this is very important, I think, for the African continent, because if we have a look at the geopolitical changes, we see a dispute between the USA and China concerning the global hegemony. And I think if Europe and Germany will become sovereign, more sovereign, then we need a new partnership with the African continent. And a new partnership means more than what the European Commission proposes in the beginning of 2020. Because this partnership was going on with the old policy, and we need a new policy, a more intensive policy. We need, and therefore we need a cooperation. But I think this will be not a dispute in the upcoming negotiations about the coalition, but this will be an issue for the debates after building a government here, because it's a real problem, and the politics has to answer to these problems.
No, excellent. I think it's really quite interesting sort of to see how, you know, some of these questions are unfolding, especially because when taking into account, as you said, you know, the very idea of strategic autonomy, of course, coming up after a very disruptive Trump administration, and the current Biden administration sort of also still, you know, struggling to reverse some of that. And it's quite interesting sort of listening to that idea of strategic autonomy and what a potential relationship between Germany, but broader the EU and Africa could look like. Maybe also just to note that there is in the chat through Mentimeter, where there's a poll out there on sort of what are some of the key areas that should shape Germany's engagement with South Africa, but also the broader EU-Africa relationship. And that takes me to my next question, Joachim, in a sense that looking more now at the South Africa-Germany relationship, we know that the president was recently in Germany with a team as part of the various G20 processes and the compact with Africa. But in terms of the potential looking forward, I'd be interested in sort of knowing what a potential coalition government would mean for bilateral relations between Germany and South Africa, and sort of what are some of the key global questions that you think both countries could cooperate on?
Yes, Of course, it's not. I cannot say what will be the result of the negotiation, but I can point out what, by my point of view, is should be priorities, and I think we will go in this direction. First of all, we need a new partnership with the whole African continent. We should not divide the different African states. That will be not good. But on the other side, cooperation with the whole continent means with all states. And there, especially for the whole South African region, like the whole SADC states, for example, South Africa must have a priority, because we have an old and good relationship between both states, especially after the apartheid, and therefore we can build on this cooperation. I think we have three main points which are very important. The first point is sustainable, to increase sustainable direct investments in South Africa. And this investment must, above all, aim at local value change, cooperation with local enterprises in South Africa, and the creation of good jobs. At the moment, we have a lack of investment from the European side in Africa, and we have to increase it, because it's not only to help the Africans, it's also for us to get new markets. That's our interest. And especially if we see the geopolitical changes, I think that this could be a win-win situation for both. Second is our bilateral relations must focus on combating and adapting climate change. It's a huge problem, the consequences of the climate change on the whole African continent, also in South Africa. We know the drought, for example, in the south of South Africa in the last years, in the very critical situation there. And therefore, it must be a priority of our cooperation. And this certainly includes the transfer of sustainable technologies and joint measures to protect biodiversity. And the third thing is a conflict of our parties, of our countries in the last month. I think against the background of the COVID-19 pandemic, Germany must show more solidarity. Above all, it must contribute as quickly as possible to ensuring that South Africa receives sufficient quantities of vaccine, or can produce sufficient quantity of vaccine in South Africa. Vaccine have to become a public good. Have to become a public good, and there we need a transfer of knowledge. By my opinion, the best way to do this are an exemption from the WTO agreement on intellectual property rights and in technology transfers. But we must have progress also in this question, because also for Europe, it's true that we only can win the fight against COVID-19 if all countries in the world win the fight against COVID-19. Otherwise, it will only be a short win also in Europe.
Oh, excellent. And I think this is really quite fascinating, because two things I think that were quite important. One, on COVID-19, you mentioned, both access to vaccines, but also equally you mentioned the importance of also utilizing the production capacity, for instance, in South Africa and potentially in other countries in Africa. And then also, I think one thing that's coming out, and I've also seen that in the chat, that some have been saying, I see Lerato there has been saying that you're absolutely spot on when it comes to the EU and Africa partnership, because in her view, this is the perfect political moment to really think in a far-reaching manner when it comes to the EU's relationship with Africa. So I think these are really quite important points, that are coming out. So it's not just access, but it's also utilizing that access capacity. I see that they have managed to sort the link now to Menti. So it will be interesting to also just get a few views coming out of that. But also just, you mentioned also the issue of continuity when it comes to relations between, at least when it comes to Germany's role in the world. And I'm quite interested to see, given the fact that, Germany has had a chancellor that has, been in office for 16 years and at a time where even multilateral institutions were taking a knock, where confidence in the multilateral order was really reducing, where even confidence in US leadership was reducing. And there were fascinating polls that around the world of how more and more countries around the world and the citizens of other countries were actually entrusting Germany more than they were entrusting other, countries in terms of really taking a lead when it comes to multilateral institutions. On the other side, there is a view that potentially with a coalition government bringing in 3 political parties, or having to bring in 3 political parties, which hasn't happened, in over 50 years, I guess, has not happened. And this is relatively new. What would it mean for Germany's continued leadership role, or the perceived leadership role in the world? Do you think Germany would necessarily take do you think that would be negatively impacted? Or do you think that, there is enough sort of institutionalized in Germany's relations with other countries that it shouldn't have so much of an impact with a new government coming in? So I'm really quite curious around Germany's continued leadership, continued perceived leadership, especially when it comes to multilateralism and addressing some of the key challenges within the existing multilateral order.
Yeah, it's difficult to say what will happen really, but I think continuity will be the main point. But we have to learn to deal with the new challenges. That's my problem, because we are not the country which wants leadership in such thing. That's a problem sometimes, because we have to learn that we need to have more leadership, because I think we can contribute a lot of positive things. And that is linked to our history. After the Second World War, we said, okay, we never want that from Germany will be a threat for the other countries in future. And that was a broad consensus for all democratic parties. And therefore, we have a distance to military actions in some way, and so on. But we have also a distance to leadership. And therefore, I think for Europe, and I think that will be possible in the new coalition, we should work together with the European Union, with our European partners, and define a way, or find a way of a positive partnership. And I talked before of European sovereignty. This will only be a good concept if we have also the sovereignty of other countries, especially of the African countries. That's the main question also for African countries, sovereignty, or the increasing sovereignty, because the experiences with the relationship to China are not always positive, I say. And therefore, we can all, but I think there is a chance that we can increase European as well as African sovereignty if we have a new partnership on these issues. And always in a multilateral multilateral forums. And therefore, I think it's necessary that we set a frame, for example, with agreements between the European Union and the African Union. And not only with some countries, we need such a forum. And then on this basis, we can have special partnership with special countries, because we have, of course, very different countries in Africa. And not one size doesn't fit all concerning the different African countries, as well as the different European countries. We are not as unified as we look at for other countries sometimes.
I think this is very important and very valid in terms of really strengthening not only European, but also the African side. And I think that's why some of the colleagues in the chat were really saying, I think this is a really important moment where we could potentially increase relations between Africa and the EU. Noting that Joachim has to go at 1, I would actually like to, well, first maybe just to read out another comment here, which is saying that, and I actually see it as a comment, I know there's a question mark. It says geopolitical stability and EU-Africa relations are good for Africa. Being an unstable focal point, re-US China competitiveness and competencies. So the way I see this is that if the EU and Africa can work together, they could actually be a source of stability in an international landscape where there's growing geopolitical competition. But what I would like to do before Joachim leaves is to actually just bring in Fébé Potgieter, who's the ANC General Manager. And especially because, you know, Joachim was also speaking about the Africa Europe aspect, and she is a former deputy chief of staff and a former ambassador to Poland. So she's, you know, very much been part of those processes also within the EU. And I think it would be great to, before you leave, to just pick her brain in terms of maybe some of the expectations that are coming, let's say, from the South African and maybe a broader African side in this space of international relations.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and once again, congratulations to the SPD for your election results. We hope that we will have the same good results on the 1st of November for our local government elections. But let me just, I want to raise about 4 issues in terms of expectations about German foreign policy going forward, and then maybe raise a 5th issue, just more about the theme of this seminar about the resurgence of social democracy. Just to make the point that during the chairship of the African Union Commission of South Africa under Dr. Dlamini Zuma, the AU at its headquarters, separately from Summit, hosted we hosted President Xi Jinping from China, we hosted Prime Minister Abba, we hosted President Obama, and we hosted Chancellor Merkel. Those were the 4 leaders that were hosted at the African Union Commission. And I think it's an indication amongst those leaders that was hosted of the importance that the AU attached to the role of Germany, not just in a bilateral way, but also in relation to the African continent and global matters. But those 4 issues, the first one is, and these are in an African perspective, the first one is this question about investment. And I'm glad that Joachim spoke about the need for the EU to define a new policy towards Africa that's different from the past, because in a sense, the policies tend to be very much steep of, you know, how things were 20 years ago, etc. You know, you've got relationships with countries, and you use those relationships, and I'm not talking about Germany in particular, but EU countries more generally, to then push for it. So the question about investment is a very important thing. We know that between 2017 and 2019, German investment in the continent increased by about $1.8 billion US. Africa represents about 1% of total German global investment. So that's one area where I think we need to look at as a continent and Germany. How is it possible to then not just, as the Development Investment Fund says it will do, to encourage German companies to invest in Africa, but also to look at how do we help the growth of the African private sector. There's a 2020 report by UNECA, which look at financing of the private sector in the continent. You know, you've got your large companies, your MTN, your Dangote, etc. But the bulk of those companies that we're talking about are small and micro, and how do we help draw them into those value chains? So I think that that's the first issue in terms of expectation about cooperation. The second one is this question about illicit financial flows. The AU in 2012 appointed and received the report of the Mbeki panel on the issue. And unlike the public perception before that the major problem of illicit financial flow are African leaders buying properties in Europe and, you know, shelving away the taxpayers into Swiss banks accounts, etc. But in fact, the major problem that we face in terms of financial illicit flows is to do with the question about tax and commercial transactions and agreements, and in fact to do with the fact that we are predominantly extractive continent in terms of business deals, in terms of mining deals, etc., etc. So we need to look at how do we cooperate in the same way that migration is an issue of a receiving and you know, contributing country. In the same way, illicit trade for financial flows is part of that. I spoke, you know, between the time when the panel gave its report to the AU Commission and, you know, last year, it hasn't reduced. In fact, from 15 billion a year that flows out of the continent, it now stands at about 88.6 billion rand a year. So we need to look at also that as another area of cooperation. The third area is the question about trade, and this is an old question. And I think that one of the issues that must change in the context of that we now have an African continental free trade area is this question of the EPAs. You know, the AU as far back as 2012, 2013 said when negotiations for the new rounds of EPA started that we cannot continue with a situation where African countries get these raw deals because they're small, they're not able to negotiate good terms. And I think that Joachim made the point that we need to move away from trying to reach these agreements as the EUs between ourselves and individual countries, but doing it in the context of that we have African continental free trade areas. You have fairly strong regional blocks, ECOWAS, you know, the COMESA, SADC, etc. But the broader context of the African continental free trade area. And you know, the sooner we see the end of the EPAs, the better. The fourth area is the important area of climate change, which Joachim also spoke about. And I mean, the reality is Africa contributes just 4% of the global emissions. But we are already suffering from 1.8% increase in climate in terms of warming, which means that countries, and this is a figure from I think 2019, 2020, African countries therefore have to spend between 3 and 9% of their GDP on adaptation, despite the fact that we only account for 4%. So there's a historical problem and there's also a contemporary problem. And this is why the negotiators at the Glasgow Court, I mean, we've got the African common position on climate change to say that we need to pay more attention towards supporting adaptation. We saw the 100 billion that were pledged at the Paris account. It hasn't really produced much in terms of tangibles, but there are concrete projects in the individual African continent, regional energy pools, you know, the Great Green Wall that includes over 20 countries now. There are concrete projects, investment in renewables, etc., that the African continents are looking at. And to then be able to say that how does the developed world and countries that are responsible for the majority of the emissions assist the continent in terms of adaptation. The problem with Africa accessing the Green Climate Fund, for example, is the fact that it's focusing up to now on mitigation, which means that we don't have to mitigate. We only, I mean, apart from South Africa, we only contribute 4%. What we need is assistance with adaptation. And this is why we need to, our delegation, that the African Common Delegation to the Glasgow talks, are very firm on these issues. And I think that there's a very strong common position around that. And I think that that's also one of the issues in terms of cooperation with the African continent. The final point is, I suppose, let me put on my political hat. I think that these the colleagues have spoken about the relationship between South Africa and Germany. I think that over the last couple of years, the relationship between the SDP and the ANC have not been what it should be, as it's been historically. That I think that on a whole range of different issues, I mean, just listening to the comrades talking about the elections, how do you bring out the non-voters? How do you adapt to politics that's increasingly social media based, that's increasingly looking at you know, the role of parties? How do you then adapt and renew and rebuild your party in that context? And I think that we can share experiences about that issue. The final issue in terms of the politics is the question about social democracy and a progressive alternative in the world. You know, the last time that I think that there has been that kind of debate between ourselves was in the context of, you know, when the debates was about, you know, multiple third ways. That there isn't just one way in terms of the contending positions. But I think that the kind of issues that we face today in terms of diversity in the world, the issues of values and identity politics, the issues of climate change, the changing nature of politics, the real attack of our global system on the issues of you know, social security, job security, etc., are real issues that as progressive left parties, we need to cooperate and look at how do we find solutions to be able to address these issues for us on a continental level, but I think indeed on a global level. And I think that the ANC and the SDP certainly have a lot in common, and a conversation on those issues should continue. Thank you very much, Program Director.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much for that input. And I thought it was quite important also that Joachim also hears some of that before he has to leave. Joachim, we know that you are pressed for time, so at any stage, feel free to quietly exit. But I think this has been a really interesting conversation on the foreign policy aspects, not only between South Africa and Germany, but also between Europe and Africa. Let me ask Nina to just come in now, just to ask, you know, to just go into, for instance, what will this possible government's political project look like? And here we really quite fascinated with the issues of social and ecological transformation. These are issues that are important not only for Germany, but they are important also, and there is resonance with some of these debates taking place in South Africa. And therefore, I'd like to ask you maybe a two-part question. The first part is really on how to form a coalition. Germans are in the German political system. I think you're more used to this. The coalition agreements become very detailed. You discuss a whole range of areas before actually signing onto a coalition agreement. That's the first part. And that's also interesting for a South African audience in a sense that our political system is becoming increasingly competitive at a local level and also at a national level. So South Africans are getting more used to coalitions also and the idea of coalitions. And then the second part of this question is that given that a significant part of the electoral debates have centered on challenges of social justice and climate policy, and on the necessity for social and ecological transformation. So, what is essentially, that common ground between the potential coalition partners, and how do you see some of those discussions unfolding within the coalition talks?
The comments are, at first I have to say I'm not part, at this time, I'm not part of the coalition, and they have also an agreement not to talk about the steps. They have, because this has to do with trust to each other, and in the past this was also a problem to get a coalition that everybody talked about each other and not with each other. So they are very strong at the moment with not talking about the steps and the development, or I have not the word for this, but I think you know what I mean. But the common things focusing the programs of the parties and the Ampel partner, the partners in an Ampel coalition, every party has this goal of the climate protection, and that we need to have this transition. But you have also to realize that we have very different methods between the partners to get to these goals. And the Liberal Party was in the past every time very focused on the big environment, in the big business, my English is not so good, the big players and a big economy, and very focused on the market, on market instruments. And when you have a look on the success in the social, ecological shifts and development during the last 20 years, this was not the success from market instruments. It was the effort and the success from good rules, good acts, especially the Renewable Energy Act. This was the most successful instrument to get a new industry surround renewable energies. And especially this act was very fighted by the FDP, the Liberal Party. So, but on the other side, the Liberal Party has also in the history of the party that it was very, how I have to say, they could change also their mind. They could adapt the new situation. And so I think really that we have the chance in an Ampel coalition also to get a good program for this social ecological transformation and all these things you need for this. But you have also to look at the past, the FDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, was also next to, in the context from the development policy and the economic cooperation, that it would have to be the success for the economy itself and not for the countries and the people. And therefore, we have a big task for, as the SPD, the Social Democratic and also the Green Party has to be very strong with this coalition, that we focused on instruments which are good for the regions or good for the people and good for the decentralized development. It could happen that it is only good for some players. And when this is the line through the coalition, I could imagine that it will not have this good benefit over the world. But when it will be possible to get the policy is focusing the decentralized development, and we will get more rules to bring this further on, focus the decentralized progress, then I think it will be also a success within the trade policy, with Fébé also focused, and all the policy which is also transferring all over the world within treaties and within common policy we have to follow on the international level. But this depends really on a strong mind from the Social Democratic Party and also the Green Party in front of the or within the coalition talks with the FDP. But I could imagine that we have a chance to get there more decentralized focus. But it's not. But it's a risk for all over the world. I think that the winner will maybe more some players. One example. Maybe I could give one example. I think the goal to get the transition to renewable energy will not be. We will not have, or we will not be successful when we will not survive the nuclear power. In this moment where the nuclear power systems will get a new life within the small reactors, maybe Bill Gates is promoting it, then the renewables will be the loser, and also the decentralized energy gaining will also be passed. And at the moment, it is really a big risk also inside the European Union that a lot of money will pushed inside instruments which are promoted by Bill Gates and the small reactors, and to get a survival for the nuclear energy. But this, I think, it is like a poison to the ecological transformation. It's like a poison, and therefore we have really be very careful. And this comes like the cooperation between the economy and the states. It seems so smart, but it is not smart. It is poison. And I think our and the Social Democratic Party has to be a clear, has to have the clear focus that the state has, and also the European Union has clear goals and clear
tasks.
Has clear task for give to make rules for this. I'm excused for this. I'm missing the words. Okay. Hopefully it is clear what I wanted to say. That this effort to get the rules that the state, also with the pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic, the state has to make all the things, not the economy. The economy needed to have the help, and we have to fulfill that the state is strong and has the ability also with getting the taxes and also on. And this is also the same with the social and ecological transformation we have to win.
Das haben wir sehr gut verstanden.
Okay, vielen Dank.
and I know that Nina, you also have to soon sort of rush off. But I must really say, you know, thank you both to yourself and to Joachim for actually availing yourselves. This is a very busy time in German politics, especially for the SPD. And we really do appreciate and hope that this conversation can be an ongoing conversation. Once in government, both at a state level, but also at a non-state level, amongst political parties, civil society. And I think this is something that we really look forward to. So I think at any given stage, when you also have to quietly slip out, feel free. We've taken a good portion of your time today, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you also very much, and I have to excuse for leaving earlier. It was not possible another way.
Yes.
Okay.
No, thank you. I think we've. Please go ahead. Okay.
But I want only to say bye-bye.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. No, I think we've had really quite a fascinating, you know, looking at both the foreign policy aspects, but also the key domestic issues. But I think one thing we're also noticing is that even with those issues that we are saying are domestic issues, are really not limited to the domestic. I mean, they really go beyond that, and these are really global issues. I know that Sebastian was doing a poll earlier on. I think it would be interesting if you have maybe some of the results from that poll, Sebastian, and then we could just continue, I think, from there, and maybe address a few of the questions in the chat. So over to you, Sebastian.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Philani, and yes, let's share those results of the Menti. Thanks for participating. Now let me find it. Now, your entries, thanks for your entries, have been transformed into a word cloud. And what I find quite interesting in that is that multilateralism and climate stand out as two issues that South Africa and Germany should be engaged more on. And a lot of the issues that are mentioned are actually not necessarily bilateral issues, but rather the joint addressing of global issues, and these two countries being very important players in their respective regions, being members of the G20, I think it makes a lot of sense to put a focus on that as well. And then another interesting aspect, I think, if you look, I mean, I won't read all the words that were entered, but if you look at it, it's not only about investment and trade. It's rather the quality of it that is strengthened here. We see a lot of entries around jobs creation, about really thinking value chains, about sustainability, and a lot of issues relating then also to the issue of climate, sustainable energy transition, just transition. So I think a whole range of issues that, well, I would argue is a very social democratic agenda for bilateral discussions. I will stop the sharing here. Philani, I've also monitored the chat in the Q&A, and I've noticed 2 blocks of questions that, well, I would be comfortable of like trying an answer. This is on the like how of forming a coalition, and also a bit more on the electoral understanding of why did Greens and Conservatives maybe not perform as they had hoped in this election. I could speak to that, but I don't want to disrupt the flow. There's another block of questions around the well, role of China, the Belt Road Initiative. I wouldn't feel comfortable discussing that. Maybe Fébé does. I just wanted to highlight these blocks of questions, and whenever you feel it fit, I am happy to come in on those.
Perfect. I was actually going to suggest that you jump straight into that, because then I think it would then allow us to then, as you address those questions that are related to yours, then we could just ask Fébé to come in also on some of the areas that are being addressed in the chat, but also on just some of the other areas that she may want to expand on from the previous input.
Hi, do you want me to come in now?
Okay.
Sorry? Oh yeah, no. I think so. So what I was suggesting is that with Sebastian on the floor, to just continue with maybe those 2 areas, and then once you're done with that, then we'll ask Fébé to just touch on and sort of wrap up in some of the other areas that she hasn't touched on.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. I mean, we are now jumping a bit between the analysis of the election and these bigger global questions, but I think we can manage. Now, there was a whole block of questions around why didn't Conservatives and Greens perform as they had hoped. And mind you, these are the 2 other parties that presented a candidate for chancellor. And I think the 2 cases are very, very different. For the Conservative Party, it is de facto the worst result in post-war history. They've never had a result below 30%, and now they're they are at around 24, 25%. And for them, that is obviously, well, seen as a disaster, and there's like a lot of discussion going in internally. What certainly, well, we are seeing is now a discussion within the party about what is really the post-Merkel Conservative Party in Germany. And as long as she was around, she was pulling obviously a lot of the votes, a lot of the voters' trust. And now there is a discussion about leadership, certainly, and about direction. And there are those who are pulling more in a way of like center-right parties around Europe that have gone a more conservative route, as for example, the Austrians. And then there are those who are maybe more in line with like what Merkel stood for, a more centrist, or even in some, like even, yeah, more centrist approach. But I think what we are seeing now is what we had as a social democratic party seen in the 2 decades that the past 2 decades, a process of renewal and discussion about programmatic future and also contested leadership. And I think we will see a lot more of that of the Conservative Party. Now with the Greens, the case is different, and I put this slide here again because yes, on election night, and I think this was quite refreshing, the candidate for Chancellor, Annalena Baerbock, she said, and this stood up and said, well, this is a disappointing result. I mean, in historic terms, it's the best result the Greens have ever had in post-war Germany. But obviously expectations were different. And this is why I put it here. I mean, they had a phase when there were, the race for strongest party was between the Conservative Party and the Greens. And this is what prompted them to also present a candidate for Chancellor for the first time ever in history. So far, it was only the Conservatives and the Social Democrats presenting a candidate. And at some point, you can see it here, was it around May or so, they were even polling strongest party. So there was a high likelihood that they would actually be strongest party and have a good shot at the Chancellor's office. And this obviously changed tactics also of all the other parties. Center of focus of attacks also being now the Green Party. And obviously there are also certainly mistakes may be made in this initial phase of the campaign by the Greens, maybe also due to the fact they never run a campaign for Chancellor. One could go into the details of what these errors might have been. Certainly there was an element also on attacks on a candidate that is a young female candidate. And I wouldn't, well, it's a contested question in Germany, but like some evidence really shows that that there was an element of sexism even, I would argue, in the electoral campaign. But then also on the final sprint, when the polls had shifted towards a race between Social Democrats and Conservatives, that didn't help the Greens either. So then the focus was really on these two parties, on Olaf Scholz or Armin Laschet, the Conservative candidate, in the final sprint of elections. And with what we've seen is a very volatile electorate that a lot of them deciding on these last weeks apparently, and certainly this dynamic of the election campaign also didn't favor the Greens. So I mean, it's a bit of a complicated response to a simple question, but as always, I mean, there are not single factors that explain results, obviously, but I think especially with the Greens, one has to be very nuanced, because obviously, like, it is their best result in history. Only against expectations raised a couple of months back, it is seen as a bit of a disappointment, and obviously they haven't made it to the chancellorship. Now, the other block of question around, like, how do you actually form a coalition? I think that's a very interesting aspect in the South African debate. Because, well, yes, on the local level, but not on the national level have we seen such coalitions here in South Africa. Obviously, there is a strong political culture of building coalition in Germany, and different experiences. The last one, the Grand Coalition that brought Merkel into power with the support of the Social Democrats, well, it was a marriage of convenience, but not necessarily of big love. One was like looking for the common denominator, but certainly at the end of that coalition, one had seen that one is running out of common ground. What they are looking for now in this coalition talks for the robot coalition is some coherence. And Scholz put it into one phrase when he said, well, we want to form a coalition that wants to be re-elected in 4 years' time. That means from the onset, like building something that has a joint project and that has the ambition to be re-elected as a robot coalition in 4 years' time. And I think that's, well, an important focus now. And obviously then a coalition needs to be more than the smallest common denominator. And I think this is what's happening now to see whether this is possible. I think given, like, if you just put manifestos next to each other, it's really easy to imagine a coalition between Greens and Social Democrats, because on many points they're very much alike, these two manifestos. I think the bigger challenge is bringing the liberals into that. Not so much on cultural and societal issues. I think we will see a lot of seeing a lot of interesting debates when it comes to legalization of cannabis, when it comes to civil rights, etc. I think there's a strong basis there. There's also, I think, an understanding of all three parties that, like, changes need to happen. when it comes to mobility, when it comes to energy transition, when it comes to climate policy in a more general sense, when it comes to public infrastructure. Obviously, then there are different ways of now how to finance that, and who should pick up the bill. And I think this will be interesting to see whether, to what extent they're now able to negotiate this. In Germany, there is a period, what we call maybe exploration, and we are still in this phase where they're talking to various actors. They have narrowed it down to the traffic light coalition for the moment, and only now will they enter proper coalition talks with extended teams of each of the parties. And as Nina has said, the ambition is to keep them secret so that they can build trust and don't have the negotiation reflected in the press. And then there will be a phase of gaining legitimacy for the agreement. The question is how the parties will do this. The Social Democratic Party in the past coalition talks did have a referendum of all of its 400,000 members on the coalition agreement. They voted largely in favor of it. So then the SPD actually signed the contract. This time around, parties haven't been 100% clear on what the process would be. A normal process would be having a sort of a National Executive Council meeting or some sort of party summit to decide on it after the negotiations are being concluded. So much about the process. Thank you.
No, that's quite interesting. Thanks for that, Sebastian. And I think it's interesting also, yes, the process of forming a coalition, but also of actually maintaining legitimacy for that coalition, both inside of the respective political parties, but also outside. And I think this is really quite an important area. I would ask then if Fébé could also then just come in. I've also noted that there is, besides the maybe the areas that she still wants to continue to touch on, there's also an added question here on how, for instance, the ANC sees itself linking with progressive parties. I've also noted that we have a hand, which I can then maybe take after that. We have a hand from Ambassador Maud Dhlomo, who's the Deputy Director General for the Americas and Europe at DIRCO. So I've noted that, and then we'll just take that hand immediately after that.
Thank you very much. And I think that overview that Sebastian gave was very interesting. But I think that I mean, South Africa, 27 years, we obviously a new kid on the block when it comes to coalitions in a democratic and multi-party context. But if one look at or let me say that one of the problems with the sort of dominant narrative in politics, political science and commentary is this whole issue about the dominant party system, and exploring the fact that, I mean, since 1994, we've had coalitions. You know, the government of national unity it may have been an enforced coalition. It wasn't a voluntary coalition, but, you know, we had for at least until the Nats left the government of national unity. And then even then the IFP still remain. We've had a coalition of sorts. We've had in a couple of national governments, we've had the IFP, we've had a ZAPO ministers as part of that, even though not taking the form of a formal coalition, but in the context of building a national project, that was the approach. You know, the very important book by MISTRA, what is it? Yeah, and marriages of inconvenience. Look at that history of coalitions over the 27 years of South Africa, particularly at local government level, but also at provincial level, because we've had that in KZN, we had that in the Western Cape. But I think that, and then of course, nearly 30 out of your 257 municipalities currently, at some point or the other, had some form of a coalition. So I think that's part of our challenges for not paying sufficient attention to it is I think on the one hand, this dominant party discourse that tend to dominate our analysis. But I also think that, you know, sort of like we tend to have a head in the sand approach towards the issues. That people will fight, we will fight as parties to make sure that we win a majority, and then wake up the day after the elections and realize that, you know, you may not have a majority, so you need to form a coalition. But in the current discourse, there are three issues which are being raised, and I think the book, the MISTRA book, also raised that. There's also a book, a specific case study by the current mayor of Ekurhuleni, who's also had a coalition in the last couple of years on the topic. So the first issue is the question about process, and I think that the German process is very interesting. And one of the issues that is being raised in the debate is that how do you go about forming, is there a formal process that's legislated to form coalition, or do you just, you know, it's just a scramble? You know, you had a situation in Cape Town I can't remember, was it 2004, where the ANC got the majority. We didn't get the, absolute majority, but we had the majority of votes, but was excluded by a ganging up of smaller parties and didn't, you know, get the chance to form a coalition. So the process of coalition forming is something that's being discussed. Shouldn't there be some kind of regulations around that, so that in line with your proportionality in the constitution, because proportionality as put forth in the constitution say that you want expression of the will of the population. So that's the one issue. The second issue is the question about the principles of the coalitions. I mean, it's certainly something that given our experience in the ANC that we're looking at now. Because at various points, it's often a question about horse trading, and you're not always quite sure what the foundations of those coalitions is. So part of what we're looking at is a sense of looking at the principles and then say this is the basis on which we engage with other parties, including with independents, because of course that's also an issue. So that is an important issue, the question about what forms the basis of the coalitions. And then the third issue, which relates to the process issue, is this question about transparency in coalition, because there's an agreement that's reached between parties, whether it's after the elections or in the course of realignment of forces mid-stream during a coalition, but there isn't a sense about what is the basis of the agreement, what are the principles that you agree on, so that when you vote against your coalition partner, or even vote for your coalition partners, is it based on a common program that you've agreed on, that this is what the coalition want to achieve? And that's one of the issues that we strongly advocating for, that the electorate needs to know what's the basis of these things, that we agree around the following principles in terms of what we want to achieve with local government, in terms of, you know, the commitment towards creating a better life, improving basic services, local economic development, gender equality, ecological transformation, etc., etc. And then you can then judge the coalition on that basis, because often they break down for reasons that's got nothing to do with principles. It's got to do with, you know, all sorts of different other things that's not really important to the electorate. The question about our link with progressive parties in the world, in the ANC. I mean, of course, our first port of call is looking at our relationships with progressive parties in the Southern African region, in the African continent. We are a member, together with the SPD, of the Socialist International, and that's also areas where we cooperate in those kind of bilateral forums, but also, you know, on a bilateral basis, as well as a government-to-government basis, there is cooperation. There has been less so over the last couple of years. And I think that certainly as the ANC, we have a very strong commitment towards looking at how do we work together with our sister parties across the world to look at how do we, cooperation on all of these issues about global warming, about a more equitable world around the social justice issues and peace. That remain an important part of the things values that unite us. You want me to answer the question about China as well? Okay.
Please do.
Yeah, I mean,
why not?
One of the things that during our chairship of the AU Commission, which we completed because the work was started before we started in 2012, was a review of Africa's partnerships with other countries of the world and regional organizations. And one of the things that's in general true, and whether it's bilateral, I mean, the one issue is the extent to which the absence of a common African position often sees countries entering into agreements that is to their detriment. So whether it is loan agreements, whether it is your economic partnership agreements, whether it is all sorts of different types of agreements on a bilateral basis, often is to the detriment. And a lot of those issues, we need to look at how do we develop common African positions on that. And therefore, in the same way that we judge our relationship with the EU or with the US or with Japan, etc., in the same way we look at our relationship with China, the Africa-China relationship, to look at what is the advantages for the continent and what are the issues of mutual benefit. I mean, I think that one of the issues, there are two specific areas that over the last 15 years, there's been strong areas of cooperation. The one area is on infrastructure development. And I think it's not necessarily a new issue, as the Chinese always remind us. I mean, the first railway between Tanzania and Zambia was built during the period of Nyerere with the assistance of the Chinese. So there's always been that cooperation in the area of infrastructure. And part of what the AU Commission need to do, and the AU, is to ensure that it assists countries to structure deals where, you don't have a thing that we help you to build the port, you didn't pay, so we're nationalizing your port. And I think that the sort of multilateral and advocacy role that the AU can play is to be able to make sure that countries assist them to enter into deals that doesn't disadvantage not just current generations but also future generations. So infrastructure is one area. The second area is on the issue of manufacturing. And I think that Ethiopia is a good example of that. Before the current trouble since 2018, but I think that there's great potential to say that China is moving towards a higher value in terms of manufacturing. How, in terms of global value chains, can Africa begin to fill that gap at that level? And if you look at the achievements of Ethiopia over that period of 15 years, you can see that it's doable. And to be able to get the transfer of skills, the investments, and building those kind of partnerships. I mean, there's often a sense that the attitudes of our traditional partners towards a new form of partnership in the continent is automatically suspicious. So, this is, I'm not accusing Germany of that. I'm talking more broadly of in a more general sense, that this is our sphere of influence, and anybody that wants to intrude on our space is seen as a threat, etc. I mean, our view as a continent has always been that we must cooperate with everybody in the world, that we must build linkages with everybody in the world, at the end of the day, to the advantage of the African continent. And I think that informs our relationship. And I think that certainly in the FOCAC meetings, and the meetings where we meet, whether it's with Japan, whether it's with the EU, whether it is with China, there's quite robust engagement around those problematic issues of the relationship that as Africans we feel problematic. But I think that the bottom line is, at the end of the day, Africa should have its sovereignty to engage in partnerships. And secondly, it needs to make sure that those partnerships benefit current generation, the continent, as well as future generations. Thanks.
No, excellent. I think really rich input, both on some of the domestic areas, but also on some of the global areas. There's quite a number of questions and interest in the issue of coalitions. And I think there were, sort of the outline of a growing literature and growing analysis in South Africa on coalitions. Publications by MISTRA and others are also contributing. So there's increasingly this discussion. And Sebastian, you can see that there's a lot of interest in the area of coalitions here. So, maybe if you could just maybe expand again on that. I think you can just see in the chats and also in the questions that a lot of people are sort of interested in. There was also a comment earlier where somebody said, okay, well, coalitions, depending on whether they agree on a set of deliverables. And it's quite clear that what Fébé was saying is that in South Africa, it's not that they've sometimes disintegrated simply because they are on principle. It's been other areas that have actually contributed to this. And looking maybe from an outsider, it sort of looks like the coalition governments in Germany are relatively stable. So when it was said that, hopefully there could be a coalition government in place by December, that is seen as a relatively quick negotiation period. And from what we've heard is that they really go into the very granular specifics of what each and every coalition partner actually wants to see in a new government before there can be, that type of agreement. So maybe if we could allow you to just come in again on this area before we look at the last sort of round of questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philani and Fébé as well. And the questions that Fébé raised around what is the kind of the framework in which one builds a coalition, I think is really relevant. Now, I think we need to understand in what kind of context we are talking about coalitions. And I think this is not a German phenomenon or South African phenomenon, but rather like almost global phenomenon, that we see a fragmentation of political landscapes and societies, but then also their representation. And when you look at the development in Germany, we used to have a parliament with 3 parties, 2 big ones polling around 40% and then a small one, and then they would form coalitions. Now we have a parliament of 6 forces, political parliamentary groups, 6 parliamentary groups, and none of them stronger than 26%. So obviously that is a reality in which forming a coalition is more complex, but also in advance that you will have to build a coalition. And I think this is a very important point. And interestingly, even though we have had a long history of coalitions in Germany, there is not much that is regulating how a coalition is formed. There is no regulation really on it. I think the most important point is establish a democratic political culture that allows for it. And I think that starts with the voter knowing on the day of the election that the manifesto he's voting for won't be implemented 100%, but because it's simply not imaginable in this political landscape nor a majority of 50+% that you would need. So you know that like compromise is needed. And I think what's then like, this is a conscious, like, I think consciousness needed on the side of the voter, but then responsibility also that goes with the political parties, that they are willing to reach compromise and to form coalition. The question then is how do you reach this compromise? So obviously trust is needed. I think the how of a coalition negotiation is really important. What we discussed earlier, what Nina mentioned when she said, well, we are now in this process of really building trust amongst each other, which means that like some sort of negotiations need to be secret, etc. And then obviously a joint agreement, sort of a government program that is agreed upon by the actors, and that needs to be more than ideally more than the smallest common denominator. And these agreements can take different shapes and forms. We've seen that in the past. And the last one was, I don't know, it was more than 100 pages, and that we had to vote upon as members of the party in a referendum. It was very detailed. Partly because there wasn't probably the same amount of trust that one would hope for in the last one, because it was a marriage, there were kind of forced marriage in a sense between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats for the circumstances at the time. Obviously one would need a certain level of trust to maybe also have a bit less detailed program, because in the last very detailed contract, nobody thought of a pandemic. And this is what pretty much shaped the whole half of the period that this government was in place. Nobody had imagined that at the time. So you need a government, as Fébé had said, that is also based and first and foremost based on some sort of joint principles and agreement of the general direction and some values. And again, I mean, a trust is certainly needed. And also, as I said initially, the ability of parties to talk to other democratic parties. Now in Germany, the question is, who is a democratic party? All of the parties ruled out a coalition with the far right, and Nathan put a question to that extent, like how to deal with the ultra right in Germany. The Conservative also considered the left party as non-democratic, their position, but they ruled out the coalition talks. But I mean, in general, parties would need to be able to talk to each other. Now, on Nathan's question on what happened to the ultra-right that had a shocking 10% in the past elections, where the issue was very much about migration. And as I said earlier, migration wasn't an issue now. What they tried to do is harvest some of the dissatisfaction with the management of the pandemic in a populist way. And they polled again or the result is again around 10%, but it didn't increase in votes. It's very worrying in some states, especially in the East, where they actually in Thuringia and Saxony are a voted strongest party. But I mean, they're stable at the 10%. And I think what is important there, and a lesson that we, I think, can draw from many elections and political strategies around Europe, is the best way to keep them small, those enemies of democracy and populists of the right and extremist, is to have a healthy debate between different political ideas around the center. And I think this is what we've seen again. The Grand Coalition has not led to what we had feared, that it would strengthen the extremes, but rather what we've seen in this campaign is very clear two very different concepts of a country, of like way forward, that were on a common democratic consensus. All of the three candidates, like it wasn't the polarization that we've seen in other areas. And I think it's an interesting debate to have now for the conservative center-right party, how to deal with the ultra-right, because clearly there's a lot of evidence also in Germany that the way to deal with them is not to copy them and be the better ultra-right and adopt some of their populist, xenophobic, nationalist rhetoric. the only thing that does is to legitimize the party, and then people would rather vote for the original. And I think there's many evidence also in these current elections to strengthen that point. But it's like an open question of how the center-right is going about this in future. But I think what has helped, again, in Germany is now that there was this clear center-left, center-right dichotomy in the elections. And what we are seeing now is a coalition that will be, yeah, in a way spreading across this center-left, center-right, again, with the liberals being more on the other side of the spectrum. So much about the dynamic there. Thank you.
No, excellent, very fascinating. But I think what it is encouraging is that it hasn't led to a strengthening of the extremes. So the center is still relatively strong. There's been sort of movements around the center, but I think you know, I think it's a positive sort of trend, especially when comparing to what some of the extreme rhetoric that is coming out or that has been coming out in the past couple of years in some countries. But really fascinating. And I think this conversation has been quite interesting, you know, moving from the domestic to the external, and also seeing that even the issues that we are calling domestic, some of those ecological transformation, the energy transition questions, these are questions that, yes, are domestic, but they are also very much global topics. I think before I hand back to Abba, let me ask if Fébé could just come with any of her final sort of comments, and also just taking into account that there is also just an interesting comment I found, which was saying that South Africa joins many networks and circles, but do they advance, you know, economic development in South Africa or other, you know, benefits? So just to consider that in your concluding remarks.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think that the question, let me start with the last question. I mean, the broad networks that South Africa join has got to do with, a lot of them has got to do with our principles, our commitment towards the African agenda, and that's why our commitment to the African Union, our work in SADC, not just at a government-to-government level, but also at a party-to-party level. Similarly, at a global level, our bilateral relationships, if you look, for example, our bilateral relationship with Germany, you know, Germany is one of our largest investors. You can't think of the South African automotive sector without thinking about German investment, and you can mention a number of other sectors, cooperation around issues of skills development, etc., etc. So I think that as I say, it's based on, the partnerships are based on principles. And I now sound like I'm still a diplomat representing the government, but I think that it is informed by those principles of our commitment towards the African agenda, and then secondly, our national interest as a country. I mean, often, you know, you can't have a too what's the word, transactional approach towards partnerships, because often, you know, those kind of partnerships may not mean much in the short term, but I think that in the long term, you know, you know, as the Freedom Charter say, you know, building peace and friendship as part of engaging with, as part of the global community of humanity. And I think that that's something that's very deeply rooted into our position as a country, but also as a movement. Just one of the issues on the coalitions, you know, I mean, we at quite an interesting point in our history as a country, because there are some really fundamental electoral reforms that are happening. For example, we've got the Constitutional Court ruling that have instructed the Home Affairs that's responsible for electoral legislation, or the Parliament to adopt legislation to allow for independents to also contest for national and provincial elections within the context of proportionalities. Now that's going to be a game changer in a lot of ways, and we don't quite know how it's going to impact on our the body politic, and how elections and democracy will then unfold within the country. But I think that the one of the things that we should not lose is the commitment towards proportionality, which is written into the constitution. I mean, and it manifests itself, for example, in 1994, we had 7 parties that got seats in parliament. Yes, the ANC got, I think we got about 64% of the vote, but we've always had quite a substantial number of parties. And it's important because there are interests that are represented by smaller parties, whether it's the African Christian Democratic Party or the IFP or the Freedom Front Plus, that may not find expression in your larger parties. But you need to make sure that you bring them into the body politic, and that your body politic represent those interests. In 2021, we have 14 parties that are in parliament, and quite interesting, the old ones have not gotten seat, ZAPO, Minority Front, you had new kids on the blocks like Al Jamaa. So I think that it's quite a dynamic system, and it's interesting in terms of how it will unfold. I think that certainly this local government elections will be very interesting as well. The IEC say there's double the amount of independents. I think the number of parties have probably quadrupled that are contesting for elections. So it will be very interesting, and then the implications therefore for our democracy, and how the system then helps us to improve local government. But thank you very much for this opportunity. I think that it was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you very much, and your input was really much appreciated, both on the domestic areas but also on the global areas. Thank you. With that, let me hand to Abba to wrap everything up for us.
Thank you, Philani. I think we're just only 1 minute over time, so we've done very well, especially given the rich discussions we've had so far. Firstly, thanks to Fébé. I think quite often when we have this kind of international relations discussions and so forth, it's useful for the South Africans to also get into conversation. And I think, and I was like taking furious notes as you were speaking as well, because just sometimes we don't have enough of these kind of forums. So that's the one thing. If you can, from FES, we can convey our thanks to Joachim and Nina. Vielen Dank, Siyabonga Kakhulu to them. And then thanks to FES for organizing this discussion. I think this was really interesting, getting the dynamics of the German democratic system, parliamentary system, and putting apart the different elements of the election result was very useful. Thanks to my co-convener, Philani, and your team from the IGD, well done in this joint effort. And then we must never forget the backroom team, Arina and Kenny and Noma. Thank you very much for all the work you guys have done. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. Then, most importantly, for everyone that has attended over lunch this 2-hour session, I think the discussions, the chats was very pointed and raised so many issues that it shows that we need a lot more of this discussion as well. So really appreciate all the points that were made. And I think what we brought into it was an ability to look at the German elections from very South African and African eyes. And I really appreciated that we could have this conversation with our friends and colleagues from Germany, but at the same time from our own perspectives, and say, why is this important? What can we learn, or what can we contribute to this? So thanks to everybody. Thanks for a wonderful 2-hour session. Really, really enjoyed every minute of it. All the best. Enjoy the afternoon. Thank you.